You've written 2 books on preaching,
Mm-hmm.
and you've had a significant emphasis on expositional preaching. Talk about that. You know, as your goal is to fold in people into the church and into the greater church, the capital C church. What role does expositional preaching play, and what role should it play, as opposed to the other approaches to preaching that are pretty common out there?
So, yeah, I believe that God builds His church by His Word. You can build a crowd on personality. You can build a crowd on gimmicks, but you can't build a church. That God brings us to life through the Word. He sustains us by the Word. And so, if I were planting a church, or if I were pastoring a church that had existed for 150 years, I would be. I don't do exposition because it's a good church planting strategy, but for theological reasons. You know, for me, expository preaching is a theologically driven method of preaching. It's not necessarily an approach you use, again, to draw multitudes. There's no reason to believe you can't draw crowds by good expository preaching, but we do it because of what we believe about the Bible. I love how 2 Timothy 3 feeds right into chapter 4 after Paul talks about the nature of the Scriptures being God-breathed. And out of that, he basically says, so naturally we should preach the Word. And a high view of Scripture should lead to substantive biblical preaching. Strangely enough, there are guys who affirm verbally the inspiration of the Bible and fail to deliver biblically substantive, expositional, Christ-centered sermons, and I don't get it. I don't understand. If they really believe God wrote a book, why they have something better to say. And we've found in a church planting environment with a lot of young people, biblical literacy, very high, they love it. And I think part of the problem with the seeker movement is an assumption that an unbeliever is not interested, or that we somehow need to do Hollywood light to bring them in. When I just find today, people expect to actually hear the Bible when they come to a church. I tell our guys, hey, if you go to Starbucks, you expect coffee. You don't expect cheeseburgers. And it's like, we're a church. Be a church. It's okay to teach the Bible. And to just make sure you can do it on a level that's understandable, that you're defining your terms, that you try to set your text in the broader biblical narrative so people can understand the framework in which this text stands. So for theological reasons, that's primary for me, is expositional preaching. I think there are some dangers in exposition to avoid. Sometimes poor exposition is what people critique. Many exposition that has detail overload, that's just loaded with parsing words and biblical background, and all of which is important. But because theologically minded guys like exposition, sometimes I think they can prepare sermons for their peers rather than people. And so a tip I just give our guys is try to preach to your old self instead of to your peers. Preach to that old 21-year-old college student that he wanted to learn, but he didn't know where the books of the Bible were. I could have sat there for an hour, and listened to a sermon if someone had explained it to me in a way that I could understand it, and I wanted to. So there are some dangers to avoid to do really good exposition, to do engaging exposition, to do exposition in a way that can speak to both the believer and unbeliever during the course of the sermon, rather than just an appeal at the end of the sermon. I think is an art that we need to cultivate. I call it pulpit hospitality, in which you're trying to bring everybody in the study. And then I think historically, a lot of expositional preaching has sometimes missed the forest for the trees, and failed to show the biblical narrative and point people to the gospel in every sermon. It's possible to preach through Nehemiah and never talk about Jesus and be labeled an expositor by some people. And I just don't think our goal is to turn over every stone in Jerusalem, and tell people where it came from, but to tell them why this is in the Bible and this bigger story. And so, in the words of Brian Chappell, to study the text with a magnifying glass and a wide-angle lens, I think is what we should try to do in order to make sure our sermons are gospel-focused, Christ-centered, that we're helping the unbeliever understand the broader biblical framework within each sermon. So that's a great challenge, but I love it. Yeah.
Good. How do you answer the sort of the common idea out there that preachers need to preach to felt needs?
So one of the things I appreciate about the seeker movement was they did try to understand audience. And so a lot of talk about contextualization is simply that. How do you, what's going on in this neighborhood? What's going on with our people? What are they dealing with? Cross-culturally in missions, we talk about the language, the difference in language, or a real important piece to contextualization is discerning idols and what people fear, hope, love, trust, believe, all of that kind of discernment, I think, has a place in preaching and understanding audience. The problem, as I see it, is the solution that was provided to these problems was never deep enough. And so they would hit on subject like worry, which we is in everywhere, every context, right? But what do you say about it, And if all you're saying to them is, do good breathing techniques, or take walks, and some of these, they're all decent ideas, but they're just not deep enough. And I see that the New Testament taking all of our problems to the gospel, that there is a Christ-centered, gospel-driven solution to worry. I'm not believing that God really is good and sovereign. It's a theological problem that I'm having. Race, is a gospel issue. I don't understand the gospel well if I'm into racism. Marriage, again, those sermons from the seekers, a lot of good tips on how to have a happy, marriage. But where is Ephesians 5, and where is the cross in marriage? So I just think they stopped short. And I think the danger is not what people are getting, but what they're not getting in that type of message. And I think our job is to give them what they're not going to get anywhere else in mainstream society. So I think we have a good bit to learn from some of the things they do in terms of ministry, like the way they greet people, hospitality, the attractional churches normally do a good job in helping people feel like, okay, I know where the restrooms are, I know where next steps table is. I think they think like outsiders really well, but preaching philosophy, I've always been like, come on, man. We've got to give them more than this. So I think there are things to learn, but I think there are serious deficiencies.